Welcome to the LSU NCBRT Preparedness Podcast. I'm your host, Ashley Markle. I am a curriculum development specialist here at NCBRT, and I work in collaboration with subject matter experts to create valuable and timely training for the responder community. The National Center for Biomedical Research and Training provides mobile training to both the national and international emergency response community. Welcome back to the podcast. Last time we introduced the topic of high-path avian influenza in the cattle population, and today we're finishing up our conversation with Jeff Whitty about some of the implications of this outbreak and kind of what the future looks like. So thank you for joining us again, Jeff.
You bet. Happy to be here.
So to start us off, can you tell us a little bit about or give us an overview, at least, of the potential implications of high-path avian influenza in cattle versus poultry?
Yeah, and a lot of this is still, work in action. We've never had a case of high-path AI in the livestock industry that we know of in anywhere in the world. And in seeing the impacts of that on the livestock industry has been a challenge for sure, because not knowing how it spread and whether it can be contained or not contained, and if there was any potential for crossover. So as we look to the challenges of today and the challenges of the future is, in the poultry world, you can snuff out the disease. You basically, if it enters the poultry operation, you depopulate the entire poultry barn, and basically sterilize it, and then do a lot of sampling, and then once everything is cleared, you can bring back poultry into that same operation. In livestock, we're not sure when it's going to be snuffed out. We're not sure how to snuff it out. We have cattle that are showing symptoms that we can treat, and you basically treat them like you do with a flu for a human. Give them the right kind of electrolytes and that kind of thing, and get them through that. But then we have asymptomatic cattle that are basically carrying the disease, shedding the virus in many cases, and then with that, we don't know when they're cleaned up. So that's going to be one of the bigger challenges that we've got to get our arms wrapped around. The other challenges is that you've got dairies in poultry world, or poultry operations in dairy world. So there's always the potential for, if the disease is lingering in one or the other, of crossover. So we've got to work really extensively with the dairies to do a lot of biosecurity applications and implementation at the dairies, meaning they're protecting their workers, wearing appropriate PPE, putting on the gloves and covering the face, and maybe even as much as wearing goggles and the booties and whatnot, and then between barns cleaning up and deconning and starting over, limiting people who come into the dairies, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of work going on right now in dairy world about increasing the biosecurity applications on dairies. So it's a lot of work in progress. And then you've still got the migratory patterns of the wild birds that we're dealing with, and understanding how that's impacting all of this as well.
Sure. And we kind of talked about this, like the idea of it mutating, and it hasn't, the virus hasn't mutated so far, but is there concern about it spreading to different species like pigs? And,
don't mention that, please. Don't mention that.
Yeah, okay, that's something we're not talking about.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We've never dealt with this in livestock at all, and it ended up in dairies, and it really ends up in lactating dairy cattle, so cattle that are producing the milk, and it really is heavy into the mammary glands and into the output, which is the milk. Yeah. It's not in the beef. It's, that kind of thing. But you never know how that might impact other species. We're not finding it in the beef cattle operations yet. And really it's because we don't milk beef cattle.
Right.
Their milk is going straight to their livestock. I was at a meeting as recently as yesterday where our state vet was asking the beef producers, if you have a sudden death of several of your baby calves, you need to really check your herd to make sure that the new mamas are in fact producing milk. Because if they're not, they may have the high path and we may need to figure out a treatment plan. So, surveillance on a dairy is really much easier than it is in a cattle operation in a state like New Mexico, where, we have ranches that can be tens of thousands of acres to several 100,000 acres in size. And the reason they're that big is because we have really dry land and it takes that much to just raise a cow.
Mm-hmm.
So, the surveillance is going to continue in that area. But you think about other confined species like swine, we really don't want it to go there. And that's why, and swine operations are really heavy into personal protective equipment, PPE use all the time anyway, because of the number of diseases that can impact a swine operation. So they're pretty good about that already, and in keeping things out and whatnot. But it's something we're going to have to keep an eye on for the future.
Okay. So why is industry collaboration so critical in mitigating these risks, and what measures are being taken?
Industry is like we teach in our classes, they control 95% of the supply chain.
Mm-hmm.
And there are initial eyes and ears on the ground. And, if it wasn't for the private veterinarians, we would still not know about this. Private veterinarians saw this. They started asking questions. They reported it to the state vets in their respective states. It takes that partnership and that collaboration when you're dealing with livestock diseases, especially, to see it early enough to get your arms around it. In this case, we had mystery disease for a couple of weeks before we even knew what it was. We called it mystery disease because we had no idea. So we were 2 to 3 weeks behind once we finally figured it out. And that's one thing in a disease with a virus that's got a high morbidity rate. If you think about a virus that's got a high mortality rate, like foot and mouth disease, you never catch up. So if you don't have that strong partnership with industry, and industry is going to be the ones that implement those biosecurity measures, they're going to be the ones that have to deal with the movement restrictions that are put in place on the livestock when they're suspect or in this case, or they have lactating dairy cattle that can't be moved without a test. The state agencies, the federal agencies could never do that on their own. And you've got to have that strong partnership with the private folks.
Thank you. So why is continued communication and coordination so essential in responding to an evolving virus like this, or an evolving situation like this?
Mm-hmm.
And how can this be achieved?
You've got in today's environment, in today's world, you've got many sources of information, and in many cases they may not have the entire picture when they're talking about the situation.
Mm-hmm.
We have been operating under the emergency support function and incident command system in our state, and many states are doing the same thing. Part of that's the Joint Information Center, so that everybody is collaborating and making sure that we have a complete message. Hopefully it's the right message, but the main thing is making sure it's a complete message. I had a discussion with the upper echelon of FDA the other day, and they're in the process of releasing some of their testing information, and piecemeal releases sometimes are not helpful because it doesn't give you the complete picture. And my request to FDA in this case was, if you release the PCR testing that shows that there are strains of the virus present in milk, you've got to follow that up with the inoculation studies, the virus isolation studies that show that pasteurization killed that virus and that it's not viable. If you just released, and we've seen some of the news entities, I call them the news entities. It may be on the social media news entity, or it may be a real news entity that's known throughout. They'll release the one segment of that, maybe the PCR testing, and the consumer might not understand that implication, that they think, okay, it's got a virus, we can't drink milk. Well, the virus is dead. It's not an issue. But they need the whole picture. So as we're going through this, when it was mystery disease, you talk about how the steps you're taking to get your arms around it. You isolate the contaminated milk product. It's never going to enter the food supply chain. Once you find out what it is, then you look at all the methods to make sure the food supply chain is safe. And that, in our case, is pasteurization and making sure that the beef supply is safe and that kind of thing. You've got to communicate that strongly and clearly and concisely so that everybody understands. And you do that, in our case, through the Joint Information Center.
Thank you. So to wrap us up today, what lessons have been learned so far from this outbreak, and how might they influence future responses to similar things, if that ever happens? I mean, this is the first time it's happened to you, so.
Yeah, no, there's many lessons that have been learned and many lessons yet to be learned. This is work in progress. So I think the greatest lesson that we've learned, number one, is don't assume anything. Early on, I mentioned in the first podcast where, initially I brought in the FBI to make sure there wasn't some terrorism nexus to this thing. Once we cleared that, and I'm kind of unique in that area because I usually ask for that analysis from the get-go, because I want to check that box and make sure that's behind us. So once we moved on from there, then you start thinking about, well, the virus in poultry does this. You think it's going to act the same. It doesn't act the same. It does not act the same in livestock. So some of the assumptions that we had were proven false. It was like every other day we proved ourselves wrong all the time. And is that a problem? Only if you try to not recognize it. And I think, I'll give USDA and I'll give many teams credit, because everybody was doing the best they could with the information they had it on the day that they had it. And the next day it was proven wrong. And so you had to shift gears and go back. And I think that's one of the greatest things we need to understand in these responses is you've got to be flexible enough to understand when you get it wrong, fix it and try to determine why and how. And those are some of the lessons I think when we get through with this, if we ever get through with this, when we will, that after action analysis is going to be really important because, in today's world, we move way too fast. I can be on the other side of the world in 26 hours in a big old jet airplane, and so can a virus. And we've lived through it on the human side. Now we're living through it on the animal side. And I think it's not whether you get the virus or not, it's how you respond to it that's going to be the game changer.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, you want to do what you can to protect the food supply in our case and protect those consumers and make sure everything is safe. And, I always tell folks if mamas can't feed their babies, we got a big problem. And I want to make sure everybody can feed their babies and their kids and themselves. So that's going to be our big challenge and our big push going forward is understanding this and then applying the lessons learned from this one to the next mystery disease that comes up.
Well, thank you so much. That about wraps up this series. This is so fascinating. Thank you so much, Jeff.
You bet. Happy to do it.
If you have any questions or topic suggestions for future episodes, please send us an email at podcast@ncbrt.lsu.edu. Make sure you subscribe to the LSU NCBRT Preparedness Podcast wherever you listen to podcasts.